Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm really excited today to be talking about an incredibly important topic, incredibly relevant today, and that is a topic that we've titled this webinar "The New Governance" and the new data governance. With me is Jessica Lee from Loeb and Loeb, who has had a very extensive and long career in the field of privacy and data protection, and has some really interesting insights into this topic. And this topic really is about what is the role of the privacy officer, the data protection officer these days. I'd like to set the stage a little bit before we launch in and my sense of things, and then get Jessica's sense of things. But the role was, it started off in the early days around the turn of the century, and no one really knew what the privacy officer was or did. But basically, it was kind of anything that was of concern on the internet for privacy, whatever that was. And over time, the role evolved, and it became much more well-defined what the role entailed. And I think the high mark was the GDPR, where the various components of a privacy program were specified by the GDPR with very big fines, and the big threat of fines. That really got companies to recognize the importance of the role, the importance of privacy programs. I think you saw some growth in terms of the importance of the role and the growth of privacy programs, more resources in that. But these days, I think there's been an evolution, and to some extent, perhaps both an evolution and a regression, an evolution toward a role that is much more undefined now. There's a lot more things in the basket of the privacy and data protection officer. It's less clear what exactly the role means and is. And also, resources are not growing. They're not keeping pace with with this role, I think. So we're in a spot where I think it's a really difficult spot for this role. What does it mean? But I'd like to start with actually what started my conversation with Jessica about this. And this is a report by the FTC. A look behind the scenes, and it's a report that was focused on social media and video streaming services, but it's a rather scathing report, a really surprising report. It's one of the most hard-hitting reports I've read from the FTC. A little bit unusual in how, if you read it, you'd be pretty shocked at how tough the FTC is being in this report. And this is really what sparked it, reading this report. So I'd like to actually start with this, since this is kind of what got us talking on this topic. Can you tell me a little bit about the report, because you had written a little bit about it, and kind of what your impression of this was?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so this is a report. It's been maybe at least a month now since it came out, but this is issued under the FTC's 6B authority, which enables it to conduct studies that don't really have a law enforcement purpose. So this is really an exercise in trying to understand, how a business works, or how a practice works, or how a company is handling data, or how a series of companies are handling data. And so in this instance, the FTC issued these orders to 9 social media and video streaming apps. And the purpose was, there was a concern about not having enough information about how the platforms operate and what information they collect and how they use it, how they're using algorithms. And as you mentioned, I think this report is interesting. It focuses on these large platforms, but it kind of ties together the full life cycle of data in a way that we haven't really seen before. We've seen the FTC focus on specific types of data. So, sensitive data, health information, or precise location information, and the harms that come from that. This is more of a comprehensive look. And to your point, not a very positive, comprehensive look on data. And so it really goes through the life cycle. So what are, the data collection practices? A lot of conversation around data minimization and purpose limitation. One of their takeaways and feedback was that, data is collected from a large number of sources, both on the platform and from third parties. There's a vast amount of data that these companies are ingesting. They're also generating data in the sense of creating insights. And then it's not always apparent, or at least in their view, not always apparent to the end user, how that data is going to be used, or even that the company has so much information about them. And this becomes important later because it goes into how that data is used beyond just sort of the privacy concerns to things like content recommendation and user engagement and potential for bias and discrimination. But just to go back, so for the data minimization piece, focusing on one, a lot of companies don't have a robust data minimization practice, inconsistent retention policies, inconsistent practices with regard to deletion, not a lot of documentation. And so that this is sort of one of their key findings here, that there's really a failure to adequately police data handling and disclosure practices. The report also, of course, goes into targeted advertising, the fact that this data is often generated for the purpose of targeted advertising. And one of the key notes in their summary was, to fix the system, you have to fix the incentives. And so they really give a critical look at this concept of, ad-supported internet, and the fact that, this data is collected for advertising purposes. That is the whole business model of many of the platforms that not all, but many of the platforms that they reviewed, and that those incentives, disincentivize good data governance, because the goal is to have as much data as possible to deliver the most relevant advertising possible. So that's another one of their kind of big takeaways here. And throughout this, I should say, they call for Congress to have federal privacy regulation that will put more guardrails in place on companies. And then they go into algorithms and data analytics and AI. And this is kind of where we see kind of the full thread, right? So because now companies are moving faster into using generative and other types of AI, what's the impact of having this data? Now it just doesn't stop with advertising. It goes on to these other use cases like content recommendation, the use of it for content moderation and for safety. And so kind of the key takeaway from all of this is there's more value in ingesting large volumes of data. There's more use cases for ingesting that data, but there isn't the corresponding data governance that the FTC would like to see in place. And they're concerned about the things that they're always concerned about, children, harm to consumers, the lack of disclosure. But this is really a comprehensive look at how these problems tend to bubble up in the context of these companies, but the problems that they flag are not unique to large streaming platforms or social media companies.
Yeah, I think that's great. And so I saw that someone had a question about what's the full name of the report. So I'm going to do a little show and tell here. The full name of the report is A Look Behind the Screens, Examining the Data Practices of Social Media and Video Streaming Services. And even though it's focused on certain particular types of companies, I think that some of the conclusions are very applicable even beyond these companies. I think this is sort of a problem that is systematic across all industries, where we're really seeing some practices that really need some better controls. And it actually, just to further show and tell, we're in an age now where we really have so many privacy laws, more than ever before. I wrote a casebook in privacy. I thought I'd show the casebook just to show how much law there is. When I started, it was a soft cover. Now it's this big, thick volume full of different laws and cases. There's so much law out there. It's a lot to update. I also have this, a little short guide, and this gets thicker and thicker. It's supposed to be a short guide, but now it's like a long guide. And I create whiteboards of privacy laws. And this is a folder of some of the whiteboards I have. Look how many privacy laws there are, these little summaries of them. And there have hundreds. Despite all this, we are in a a spot where are the laws really doing the job? Is the needle really moving? We've had the GDPR now. We have roughly 20 states with privacy laws. We're seeing all sorts of new laws with certain more narrow privacy areas like biometric information, health data, children's data, and so on, online content moderation. And yet, it seems that, the problems persist. They almost get worse. And I just wonder, and we keep talking, we need more law. We need an answer. But aren't these the laws the answer? And I've long thought, no, I think the law is kind of going in the wrong direction, taking the wrong approaches. I'm curious what you think generally about the laws out there. And is the problem with the laws aren't the right laws, or is the problem in enforcement of the laws, that they're just not being fully enforced in a way that really is creating the right incentives? Is it both, or something else?
I think it's a mix of things. And I will say, I do think it's somewhat unfair to say the laws don't work at all or the needle hasn't moved at all, because, I think what you hear and what you want to see are fines or reports like this, and, pointing out what hasn't happened. But what has happened inside a lot of companies are programs, right? Are there perfect programs everywhere? Of course not. But I do think that there is more internal data governance in most companies than there were, call it in 2018, even, for US companies that really had to focus on CCPA and all the state laws that follow that. So there are things that are being done internally. They're just not always, out and visible. So it's hard to point out when harms aren't happening, right? It's easier to point out when they are. But in terms of why there could be a ceiling, and I don't really think it's a ceiling necessarily. I just think it's an evolution, and it's also a cultural and technical evolution. So if you put the laws aside, to realize that the U.S., I won't say they didn't have a comprehensive privacy law, right? We've had this patchwork, and so for a number of companies, they were operating in this gray area that allowed for a lot of innovation. And so when you have laws that come in now, part of the challenge is systems weren't built to respond to some of these laws. So we always talk about the laws lagging behind the technology. There's some places where the law is ahead of what the technology allows, and would require things to break internally. And so I think, one piece of this is just a practical, technical struggle of trying to figure out, if you didn't build your systems internally or your data structure internally towards, complying with these laws, retrofitting that can be challenging. There's, data sitting in a number of different systems, and, is that all great? No, but again, these are, companies that were kind of building as they went. So I feel like that's one challenge. And then you have the cultural challenge of, again, in the US, this is really a shift in how we've thought about privacy, how we've thought about consumer rights, how we've thought about obligations. I mean, again, could that have been there before? Yes, but it's still a cultural shift to try to move companies in this direction and to change the thinking around data. We even have conversations still, like, who owns the data? Do company A own the data, or does company B own the data? And if you ask a European lawyer, they'll tell you the individual owns the data. Like, we're still having some of these, cultural challenges. And then the last bucket, I do think, is it's a mix of the laws, right? So the laws, which I think is helpful because it's hard to be very prescriptive for companies of all different sizes and industries, et cetera. But I think the laws tend to have some very specific things you need to do, and then some things you need to do that give you a little bit more room. And I think that becomes a challenge for companies to figure out, like, how far do I need to go there? So if I need to offer, this set of consumer rights, well, I can put the form on the site and we can set up a process internally, and, hopefully it works, and there's probably things that need to be sorted out, but at least we've kind of done the thing that the law wanted us to do that was specific. But the principles that were called out in this report, the concepts around data minimization, for example, that has been there before this report, that's been there in the state laws. But I think, like, what does that mean internally, or what the expectation is? There's still gray around that. And so you're not going to see, consistency or perfection at all in terms of how companies are thinking about these concepts.
Yeah, and I think that, sort of laws often have kind of two, tracks, or pillars or dimensions. One is the individual rights dimension, where, individuals have various rights to access and delete their data and correct their data. I've criticized this as, being inadequate and over relied upon. Because individuals really can't manage their privacy at scale with all the companies and really understand what is going on. So I think that while I wouldn't say don't have rights, I think that the rights are not enough. So the other pillar is there's these requirements internally to have various programmatic governance measures, such as a privacy officer, do data impact assessments, have various other internal mechanisms to ensure that data is used appropriately, like data minimization requirements and so on. And these have created, I think this is actually a very valuable thing. I think it's very important. Ultimately, enforcement of a law really depends upon internal measures being done. If it's purely external, it's just not going to work. It has to be, companies have to do work within to really make this happen. And that does delegate a lot to the companies to build this and to do this. And the laws, I think, fortunately don't specify enough or a little too open-ended, a little too vague on these fronts, and sometimes a little too thin on these fronts, so that what we get in the internal programs is very varied, and it's not clear what they are to actually be like. I'll do another show and tell. There's a book that was written, somewhat recently by Professor Ari Waldman, Industry Unbound, and it is a scathing book. And I think that, if privacy professionals read it, they might first find it like a little off-putting, like, yikes, it's so brutal. Basically saying that these privacy programs are essentially, just a total facade. And they're, he really, it's a really powerful critique. But I think that, I wouldn't dismiss it just because it's so strong and so hard-hitting, and it might be painful to read this. I think there is a lot here that is worth thinking about. It's really raising a big challenge, and that is, it is possible under these laws to have privacy programs that are very much like a checkbox mechanical exercise that ultimately, tick off all the boxes, but are very hollow. And that's sort of a kind of a compliance mindset. Well, we have to do an impact assessment, so we'll just do something. We have to do this, so we'll just kind of check a box. We'll stand up these programs. We'll create this documentation. We'll go through all this because companies are good at it. And we'll do it on the cheap. We really won't have a lot of resources to it. We really don't need to do it well. We'll just have to kind of just do something. And I think that, that debate kind of at the time of GDPR for global companies, and then when the states started passing their laws, companies, okay, we'll do this, but the laws often don't say enough about, well, what is a quality program? What's great? What's good? What's satisfactory? What's mediocre? And I think that's a problem, because it without a clear sense of what is a great program, is it really meaningful if companies can just get away with a so-so program? Because devil's in the details. I think a really great program can do great things, but that's often not what companies have. And so I'm wondering, how to get that to happen. How does because I actually think too that the privacy and data protection officers I talk to really want to have a great program.
Yeah.
I don't think many, wake up saying, my job is to have the crappiest program that possibly can pass muster. Most really want to have a good program. They take pride in having a good program. The problem I see is that they don't have the resources and the corporate buy-in to have a great program. They might have convinced them with GDPR that we need to have a program, but have they really convinced them that we need to have a great program? And how do they do that? Because I look on the security side and I see a different story where security says whatever, they say boo and money flies in, resources fly in. The team is, big at a magnitude that makes privacy look like a pauper. So how do we get privacy to kind of go where security has gone? Why hasn't it gone to that level? And how do we get it to that level?
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot to unpack there. I think there's probably two things that security has, right? So on the one side, they have the risk. And I think that's how you have to look at this. Like, what's the risk and what's the business opportunity? So on the risk side, obviously, security goes well beyond, personal data. It goes to, corporate assets, proprietary information. There are well-known, huge financial consequences in terms of, ransomware and breach, not just from a legal perspective and enforcement and class actions, but just not having access to your data, or what that means in terms of your agreements with your customers, if you're in a vendor position, or what it says to your consumers, if you're consumer facing. I think it's risen to that level because of all the security breaches that have happened and all the potential access to other data, that the remit is so much broader. So if you look at someone's like risk register, for example, like these security issues are going to be high up on that list, where, privacy, I think, has been in that bucket of personal data. And there are some companies for whom that's very important. So, those programs look different, those resources look different. But in some places that can be seen as, I think, potentially a narrower scope. And without big enforcement, maybe it doesn't rise to the same level on the risk register. So, and I do think that will start to change as you see, more enforcement, particularly when that enforcement comes with things like data deletion orders or, algorithmic deletion, like that has significant business impact beyond just like the legal risk and the dollars. But then I think the other side is also what's the business opportunity, and companies or, privacy officers in particular, who I've seen done this well, do a couple, what's the culture, getting the culture on board, having the business teams recognize the value of having a strong privacy program and be able to sell that to whoever the customer is, whether that's a business or a consumer, and have that be kind of embedded in the core values of the organization, or have it, be tied to some strategic business initiative, because there's a world where having a strong privacy program does unlock your ability to use data in certain cases, but be able to use that in a responsible way. And so if you take it kind of out of the compliance, you just have to like check all these boxes so we can say we did the thing and put it on paper in case anyone asks. If you go more broadly and say, how can we align the privacy program with our strategic business initiatives, because data more and more is going to be critical to how we, unlock future streams of revenue, I think that also becomes a motivator. And then the FTC flagged it. It's, because these are corporations. We can be honest. I think you have corporations that have good motivation, but at the end of the day, they have to make money. In some cases, they have to respond to shareholders. And so, the incentives, as the FTC said, to fix the system, fix the incentives. The incentives are to create revenue. And so for your privacy program to get support, I think you have to find a way to align it strategically with that, and also flag the risk and the rising risk of not complying with these laws, and what that means, again, not just from the legal side, but from a business side, access to using your data, access to doing the things that the business has put as a priority. But that's an evolving conversation.
So let's talk a little bit about data minimization, because I think it's a really good example of some of the challenges you're talking about. A lot of the laws say data minimization, and FTC says data minimization. No one, all the privacy advocates and the privacy scholars say data minimization. It seems like everyone loves data minimization, but data minimization is something that it's kind of hard to define. It's almost like I know it when I see it. But the thing is, what does that mean? Because when a privacy officer sees it, when the FTC sees it, or when a corporate CEO sees it, but the incentives for companies are probably, data minimization doesn't seem to be a big incentive, right? It's like, okay, data maximalization seems like the main incentive, like collect all this data. We never know how it's going to be used in the future. So we want to collect a lot of it, keep it. And yeah, there's a risk by keeping it, but there's a great benefit in that we just never know down the road what it can bring. And AI is a case in point. Like, oh wow, if we're sitting on all this data, this is great for us. Now we can use it. If we had if we kind of maximized what we could do under the law to essentially get everyone not to opt out, and they have all sorts of ways they can sort of tap into this data and use it, and all that sort of cuts against data minimization. We love to say it as a principle. But then when it comes down to reality, how does this actually work? How does it have teeth? How does it get enforced? How does it work internally? How does the case be made internally? How do you go to the CEO and say, hey, let's purge all this data, let's get rid of it? It could be that this could be like incredibly valuable, like liquid gold to our AI, but let's just get rid of it because it's the right thing to do. And yeah. I just wondered, like, how does that work incentives wise?
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's tough, right? There's in a world where everyone is moving towards AI solutions or tools or development or wherever you kind of fall in the space, obviously getting access to data is critical to those initiatives. So it's hard to say, oh, we should collect less when everyone's trying to collect more. But I do think there are cases to make. I mean, on the one, if we're talking just about deletion of data and how long to retain data, that to me could be slightly easier in some respects. One, because there's a clear breach risk, the more and a dollar's risk because it costs money to store data, but the more data you keep, the longer you keep, the more your exposure is. And for a lot of what companies want to do, you don't actually need to keep all of the data in its current form, right? So I think this is where you can use things like privacy enhancing technologies, making an argument potentially that you've de-identified data if you can meet the de-identification standards, but being able to continue to leverage that data, but maybe not store it in a way that it continues to be, tied to personal information. I think that's, one potential way to make this argument and to sell the reduced storage costs or sell, to sell the minimized security risk, but then also the ability to potentially use data for longer purposes if you add some controls to it. So I think that is one argument internally. I think the harder argument up front is how do you make the argument not to collect it in the first place if you can? And I think the example of the flashlight that collects location information, like people have talked about that for years, but that's not really what we're talking about now. Now we're talking about ingesting data from third parties to get more information. Again, whether it's for advertising or for personalization or recommendations or to power AI, that we're getting data from third parties to enhance our understanding of who the end user is. And the question is going to become, what is the value of that? If we're supposed to only collect what we need, is it what we need to provide the service, which is what's suggested in Maryland's privacy law? And then what do you need to just provide the service, and how does that change if that service is ad supported? Like, there is some value in getting information that helps you know who your customer is. I think the better question is, how much of that do you really need? And how can you use it in a way that layers on additional privacy protections? So for me, I almost wish it was less data minimization and more like data responsibility, Right? So it's not about what you collect, but it's about storing in a way that's safe and secure, sharing in a way that's safe and secure. Obviously, you have, consumer rights and transparency and all of that. But there is a world where there are legitimate uses for data, and there are technical solutions that can be used to minimize the risk to the consumer of having that data being used. That doesn't work in all cases, but I would like to see a little bit more of that conversation and understand where the lines get drawn. Because the idea that a company is going to collect something just for their service and not have to try to understand their customer, or not want to have the opportunity to build out additional, business lines or take advantage of new technology, that doesn't seem very realistic to me. So I don't think we know kind of where the line on minimization is going to fall quite yet.
Yeah, I think that those are really good points, and I want to play onto them and kind of play like annoying professor here a little bit because so here's the challenge with today. I think with any of this is with AI, the algorithms are taking data and are able to come up with we're seeing all sorts of interesting new uses of data that we didn't realize had much use. And I'll actually go back to a really old anecdote that's often used constantly in privacy circles, and I've used it a zillion times. It's actually 12 years old. And it's the anecdote of the Target case where they used customer data, to identify who was pregnant. So they could market baby products to them early on. And the interesting thing is the data that, indicated this were just routine purchases, such as unscented products or cotton balls and things like that. Now, they didn't know this until they kind of put the algorithm onto it to kind of look at the patterns. And I think we're going to see a lot of this where, we don't know what data is the kind of winning lottery ticket in the pool. But the more data you get and the more you can feed it into the system, the more the potential uses or things of the data might show us about a customer that could then open up new marketing opportunities or new interesting uses. So that seems to be a big incentive for a company to say, look, we should be avoid minimization, and we should try out these new uses to see what we might do, and then craft our privacy policies and our notices so that we are pretty vague about what our services are and what we might use the data for, so that when the new purposes come up, we're not going to have our hands tied because we define them too narrowly. And so I just wonder, is that, and also on the other thing that's pushing against the minimization approach too, is it's tougher to enforce. It requires more of a qualitative judgment that depends on how a company has chosen to evolve its uses of the data. It's much easier for an enforcement agency to go after something pretty simple and obvious. Oh, your notice wasn't adequate. Oops, you didn't respond to a data subject access request in, whatever number of days. You're a day late, so gotcha. So it's hard to do data minimization because there's a lot of arguments that you don't know our business, you don't know what we're doing, we're constantly evolving and changing, and we can craft our notice to kind of fit uses that are for knowing our customer better, doing our service better, but our service is broad. So I'm wondering, how do we do that? Is it really easily enforceable? How does the law combat that? How do you respond to a CEO that would say, look, I get it. There are costs to storing the data. There are some concerns, but at the end of the day, isn't it, the upside is I win the lottery. I use the data in some really cool, interesting new way with AI to do something that's going to generate tons of revenue. Or maybe, the FTC comes after me and says I didn't minimize enough. Maybe there's a cost, but the benefit, it seems much more exciting to them. So what do you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard.
I'm just an annoying professor.
No, I mean, it's hard to argue against that, right? And I don't necessarily think that all of those are bad things, right? Like, you have, if I'm a company and I made toilet paper for years, I don't know, I might be reaching the market saturation on my toilet paper sales, and where else can I go? Like, how do we figure out, the idea that companies can evolve and grow and be profitable shouldn't be a bad thing. I feel like we always talk about this in terms of like these massive companies who we label evil for one reason or another, but there's a layer of companies under that are just, trying to figure out where their business goes. And some of that is involved with looking at their data and using it for, internal purposes. And I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. I think where we get to, uses that are more concerning, is like the Target example. So that's more, to me, it's less about governance. It's not that, you shouldn't have taken in the data that someone bought, Q-tips and cotton balls, but it's how that data got used and the insights that it was used to generate. And, are there guardrails that we can put in place there so that it's not, cutting off all potential, what you would call in the EU a legitimate interest of data, but it's protecting against what's ultimately the harm. Because, I think it'll be a long time before we get into a world where we're really, strong arming companies not to collect, certain data that they have other use cases for. I think the business case isn't going to be there. To your point, it's, very difficult to enforce. And then if you have to look at harms, there's a lot of space in between, the Target example and all of the other business activities that a company engages in. So how do we try to reduce the harms and those harmful uses of data? I think that might be a more effective way to spend time, and something that's easier to govern, which is probably also why you see the FTC going after very concrete, uses of healthcare data, uses of precise geolocation information, or there are, potential harms that at least can be pointed to, even if they can be challenged later. There are at least some harms that can be articulated, as opposed to it was just too much and a business used it to understand there was a new business opportunity. Well, what's the bad part of that? I think you have to get to like, what's the harmful part of that we're trying to get to.
Yeah, and I think that, we look at the role of the privacy officer, internally, it's going to be, to make the case for this. How do we sell it to the company that it's in the company's best interest to do something when it could be that, maybe there's not going to be, the enforcement. We can hope, I always hope, the law gets stronger and the law creates the right incentives, and those incentives then lead companies to, really, take it more seriously. Like, with security, though I don't think security law is actually working that well either, but still they're more scared of it. Less scared of privacy, and the laws could ratchet up the fear. But internally, the privacy officer does play a role. And as you said, there's kind of the carrot approach. How does this enhance a company's business? How can it help the business? Could privacy become not just a cost center? And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on, how does privacy move out of being a cost center and make the case that this is actually going to, help the business achieve its goals rather than impede the goals of the business?
Yeah, and I mean, I do think it's the counter argument to data minimization. I think there's an argument the privacy office can make about getting access to more data, not always personal, right? Depends on what form it's in. But I think that's the argument that the privacy office can make. And I do see the remit of the office expanding, and particularly in the last couple of years, while some companies were trying to address the potential of, Google sunsetting third-party cookies. There was a lot of conversation, at least, around the advertising world, around first-party data. And I think you'll see this in other spaces as well. How do we get access to this data? We don't want to be dependent on another company for their information. If we have access to the consumer, how can we start to get more of this? And that's where the concept of consumer trust comes in, because it's not just privacy enforcers or privacy advocates. I do think you see consumers are smarter about these issues as well. They're getting reported on in the media. So there's a brand element to this. And I think there's an argument for, as privacy officers now have to deal with maybe trust and ethics, or if they're taking on AI, these concepts kind of get pulled in together. And it's the idea that if we set things up properly, we will be able to unlock the use of the information that we have in a way that's safe, that's going to, keep the consumers happy, keep them trusting us, not having them opt out at mass scale unless they want to, because they understand our use will keep us out of the crosshairs of enforcement, and maybe can store the data in a way that's minimizing our, exposure from the security standpoint. I think that's kind of how privacy, starts to make that business argument. And there've been conversations about what do the KPIs of a privacy office look like? What are your key performance indicators? Is it the number of privacy assessments that you do in the course of a year? Probably not. But if it's we were able to help partner with a team and get this product launched, for example, or enhance this new business capability because we got these terms in place. I think that's kind of where you can start to make more of a business argument. Or now we have access to this data because we've, de-identified it, or we'll used it in this other space that is more protective. And so now we can, have better access to it and gain more insight. Obviously this is very generic for companies in a number of industries, but I do think there is an argument about the privacy office helping the use of data internally, as opposed to just being like, no, you can't use it, and we have to put all these compliance checkpoints in place. That's a strategic partnership that I was talking about earlier, and I do think there is opportunity there.
Yeah, and I also wonder, how does the privacy officer has a little bit of a tightrope to walk too, right? You want to say, hey, I'm doing a good job. We have a good program. It's good. You don't want to say, well, wow, we have a really awful privacy program. We're doing awfully here. On the other hand, the privacy wants to make a case that the program should improve. The program needs more resources. The job is really hard. I haven't seen any privacy officers say, yep, I have all the resources I need. I have all the team members I need. This is so easy. We're just humming along. So there's the case that has to be made that, hey, there's our privacy program may be at like a 5 out of 10, and it should be an 8 out of 10, or a 9 out of 10, or a 10 out of 10. And what we lack, though, is a way to measure it. Like, how do you measure if a privacy program is good or not? Is it how many DPIAs do you do, or how many DSARs do you respond to? How quickly? It's not. There's a lacking of any sense, because the laws don't give us like what's good and what's not. What is good data minimization and what's not? What is good? What's a good data impact analysis look like? A privacy impact assessment. We really lack a lot of ways to measure it. So it's like they can say, okay, yeah, give us 1 week, we can do a little bit of better job. But then what makes the strong case that, well, why isn't what you're doing now okay? Why should we, why does qualitative improvement matter as long as we have something? Because everyone now has something. So it's a lot easier to make the case like, okay, you don't have a program, we need a program. If we don't, we're going to get a fine. Now you have a program. So how do you make the case that like it should be better? And are there ways that we can measure it so that someone could say, yeah, it's our program is here, and it needs to get there. And especially when there's some tension there, because a privacy officer doesn't want to say, well, our program is awful, then unethical. Isn't that your job?
Right,
Yeah,
right.
that's the challenge I think we face is for privacy officers is how do they navigate that and make that business case?
Yeah, and I mean, it's tough because to your point, you don't want to say there's a problem with your program, but I think you can point to gaps, right? Like, I mean, again, nothing's going to be perfect, but I think you can point to, again, gaps or lack of business support. So, gaps mean we've said this or we put this in place, but we know it's not perfect. We know there are holes in it. And now we know that the FTC is really interested in this area, or the state AGs are really interested in this area. And so while, no one's reached out to us yet, we know this thing is bubbling under the surface and we need to get on top of it, right? So that's, I think one, potential avenue. But to the extent you do have a program and, business and products or deals have to come through your group, I think that's another place to point to see, the privacy team support it. Because, when I mentioned the other players who are interested, I said, the consumers, regulators, but it's also your business partners want to know, okay, we're sharing data. Are you going to increase my liability because I'm doing business with you, or I'm sharing data with you, or I'm taking your data? What terms are in place there? So I think that's another place you can say, well, we can only move but so quickly, and the team wants to enter into all these deals. We need more resources on that end too, both to vet our partners, but also to help, get these terms in place that allow us to get access to data. So, I mean, where this sits for you is going to depend on, kind of the nature of your business and where your pressures and your incentives come from. But again, I do think, if you have consumers who are in every inbox complaining about the experience and on social media complaining about the experience, one, you're putting yourself on the radar for regulators, but two, you're also not creating a good consumer experience. So kind of depending on where you sit, there's a consumer argument to be made. I think there's a business deal argument to be made. I think that's kind of the push behind some of the security advancements. Partners want to know that you have, ISO 2700 or whatever it is. You need to be able to, show that you have these certifications. We don't really have that for the privacy space. There's no certification necessarily, but standing up these programs will help potentially get deals done. So kind of how you make your business argument is going to depend on where your business incentives come from. But because data has become so critical in so many areas, I think that's the opportunity for the privacy officer to open things up. But I mean, to be transparent, unfortunately, if you're in a company where data and personal data in particular isn't, a key driver of the business or viewed as a valuable asset, you probably have it and you have to do something for it so you can, have the policy on your site and do the things you need to do. But that it's harder to get more resources in a space like that, as opposed to where you're in a space where the data is actually a valuable or critical piece of the business. And I think the privacy officer can align that business incentive with the role that they need and why, and point out the gaps and say, here's why we need more resources, and here's what we can deliver with those additional resources back to you.
Yeah, and I think that one thing, when we, as an educator, I train privacy lawyers, many of whom go on to be privacy officers. But what they don't get training in is business. They know the rules, they know the law, they know what to do with the law, but they really don't know, how to talk to the C-suite. They don't know how to really size up the businesses they work in and understand the things that you're talking about, which is how to explain it in light of what the business is doing, how to align it with the business goals, how to strategize and do that kind of work. It's just something that, we really don't have. I haven't seen much of a curriculum on it or anything on it, but it's something I think would be valuable for privacy officers to learn, is sort of how to do these things and how to do them more effectively, because that could move the needle internally. I do want to talk a little bit about a topic about a little bit of the evolution of the role of the privacy officer, the data protection officer, because now it seems that the role is it keeps evolving as more laws are getting passed, and with each, there's a lot more laws than there were were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I think like if only like the pay and resources of a privacy officer kept pace with the laws, it would be wonderful. But it's kind of like, wow, hey, you have more work. You have 30 new laws this year to comply with on all these different topics, but you get like a small little raise. It's asking a lot of a privacy officer to comply with so many different laws around the world, in all the different states, laws that are oftentimes slightly inconsistent with each other, sometimes very inconsistent with each other. And now we have the AI laws. And I see that being kind of also thrown, like, let's just throw it into the privacy officer's bucket too. Why not? Because, unless you create a whole new AI officer, it's like, who are you going to give it to? Well, there's a law, privacy officer. So I wonder how this world has evolved over the years, from pre-GDPR to post-GDPR to today. Does it even make sense to call them a chief privacy officer anymore, a data protection officer, or something else? Like, what is the role now? And how is it different from how it was in the past?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely evolving, from what I can see sitting on the outside. And, I think, kind of starting around GDPR time for US companies, you may have had someone tapped for privacy. Okay, well, whether it was privacy lead or a privacy officer role, it's like, well, we need to have someone who can oversee this. This has become, now an area or a domain of the company that needs to be managed. And so now we have someone, and, I've seen this scale up. So you start with one or two lawyers who are just looking at what a company has to do, into their companies who have, very fulsome teams of, lawyers and non-lawyers who are, operating really large privacy programs, who, manage all the rights, do the, impact assessments, do vendor management, have robust programs in place. And I think there's still a world where that continues, because I actually had someone say, well, don't you think privacy will just end up being like, like any of the other compliance, like anti-bribery, just like check a couple boxes every year and certify you did it. And I said, maybe for some companies, but again, if data is a core part of your business, I don't think it ever just becomes that simple of an exercise, because the use cases are evolving, the data is evolving, and nothing's ever going to fit in that kind of like neat box. So I think there's still a role for that. But I think, and kind of what we saw in this FTC report, which is how we started this conversation, the idea of personal information, personal data, the definitions have expanded. And as the uses have expanded, I think that's where you see the privacy office remit expanding as well. Because if you think about what you might need to stand up for, an AI governance program, for example, it's probably the privacy office that has most of the bones, at least of what that program needs to look like. It can't just be the privacy office, because it's, you need IP, you need patents, you need a cross-functional team to really deal with these issues. But privacy in terms of governance and policies and understanding how to review something through the product life cycle, probably, some of that infrastructure sits with privacy. And so I feel like the idea is now moving from just administration of privacy laws to more fulsome, okay, what is our data governance program look like? That might be personal data, that might go beyond personal data. And I think that's also where some of those strategic conversations come in. How are we managing our data in a way that we can use it to the best way possible? Are we structuring it and storing it properly? Are we securing it so we're not creating any issues? Do we have again, like a life cycle through which we review products that are going to use that data, and we know who gets it, and that's really where you start to see the maturity of a privacy program. But again, it's not just privacy, really. It's data governance, and I think that's where at least I see this next evolution going. Now that these big privacy teams are built up and they're focused on privacy specific laws, we're going outside of that. And I've seen a combination of privacy and AI, and privacy and governance, and privacy and ethics and trust, also product privacy. So, someone who's looking at privacy, but really through the lens of a specific product, going more granular into what that product is doing. And I think companies are still trying to figure out kind of where this role sits or how it will evolve, but the evolution is happening right now.
I think that's really interesting and astute because it seems that like where does the privacy officer sit? They're legal, they're compliance, a kind of subset of legal to some extent. They also do a lot with IT, but they're not quite IT, and they're business too. Do they sit in business, especially if the role and the stature of the role and the importance of the role is showing how this relates to business? Maybe privacy should have a foot in business and sit in business where the business decisions are made, not just kind of like run through legal after they're made. I've spoken to at least one person who's kind of on doing privacy in the business side, interestingly, of a company, not in legal, and was in legal and went to business. And it's very interesting, how a little different things are in the business. Just a lot more resources and a lot more ability to get things done earlier in the process rather than kind of later in the process in legal. So, how do we situate this role? What is this role? Because it's kind of like all of these. It's like a utility player, a fusion of these different roles, and it's evolving now with AI into this kind of broad data governance role. But what does that role look like, and how does that role get shaped? The laws typically just kind of contemplate a kind of older fashioned, have a privacy officer in these cases. But this kind of new role is a little different, but I don't think there's a blueprint yet for it. I think we're almost like we've evolved almost like full circle back to where the early days of the privacy role were. What's the role exactly? Where should it sit? What's going on with the role? So it's a weird evolution, but I feel like that's kind of where we are now. And I guess what I'm struggling with is, who does what? Like, how does this go forward? How does the privacy professional help shape that role and what that role is? What should the laws do to try to push that role? How does this get guided in certain ways? Because I do feel that the original role was kind of like, it didn't have a lot of guidance. It just kind of developed up. But here we are now, kind of back there again. And I'm wondering, like, what you would advise for, what next? How does this role complete its evolution and not kind of stay where it is now, which is kind of in this weird, uncertain, undefined area where it's not clear if resources are growing with the role, the responsibilities aren't clear, and even where the role should sit isn't clear. So I'm wondering, like, what's next? How do we help this process along?
Yeah, I mean, this is tough. I don't know if we're going to solve it on the call. But I do, a number of companies introduce this concept of a chief data officer or data strategy officer or something along those lines. And I always wished that person was a business and, privacy professional molded into one. Right. Because I think there needs to be in any company an overarching viewpoint of how you want to look at data and who you want to be, how you want to philosophically handle these ideas, how you want to go out into the world. Are you trying to be really consumer protective? Are you trying to be really aggressive? Kind of where do you fall? And then the roles for the privacy professional should kind of flow down there. Some of that, under a data officer won't be personal information. That'll get held, managed by a business person or by a security person. But the world where you do have personal information, I think there's a role for the privacy professional to play. And I kind of like we'll see where things go. I kind of like that it's in flux because I do think it potentially opens doors. A cynical view of having a privacy person sit in a business office is that person gets corrupted by the business incentives and just does the minimum privacy necessary to get the product out the door. But again, in a different world where your top-down messaging is different, that person could help infuse, privacy principles into a product so it gets out without having some of the challenges that we've seen some other kind of data-driven products have when it goes out the door. So if you take the position that you could do this in a way that's not cynical and have someone at the business level, I do think that there is value there. But I think you also need to have someone who sits over an entire program with a viewpoint into how everything is working together. Because again, we're seeing the FTC is looking at how everything is working together. We know companies internally are ingesting data at different different points of entry and using it for a number of purposes. This requires an overarching view, but there's going to be a role for, I think, the privacy person, both at that high level, and then also when we get to the specific levels of how do you start to infuse these principles as you're building out a product. Like I kind of like a privacy governance layer and then a product layer so that all of those governance principles that are getting put in place can see themselves through a product. And again, maybe there's more, maybe there are more dollars there, but that person also gets in early and is more aligned. And so you don't have the typical like legal versus business friction while you're trying to get something out the door. But, I'm sure there are many other iterations of how this could work and could work well. But my hope for privacy professionals is that we see this as an opportunity to continue to grow and demonstrate, the value beyond just the laws. This wave of privacy legislation will come to an end at some point. Not that there won't be laws anymore, but this piece will come to an end. And I think it's important for us to make sure there's a strong case for, even if we don't have 10 laws getting passed each year, it's still going to be critical to a business to put priority into these positions.
Every time I think the pace is going to slow down, it speeds up. So I'm still waiting after 25 years in this field to see the slowdown. But we'll see. But I think that I thank you so much for this conversation. Your insights are really great and thoughtful. I think that conversations like this are the starting point for how do we create probably more than one blueprint, but a set of blueprints for this role, where this role goes, so that there's something that we can look to that will say, okay, this is what that is. It looked like around the GDPR time, I was saying, hey, the GDPR is nice because it actually finally provides a bit of a blueprint for what privacy is all about. And before there really wasn't as comprehensive a blueprint. Now GDPR gave it to us, but here we are again. Now it's more complicated. And I think we need a new set of blueprints for what this role is, why it's important for the business. I think we need to help privacy officers get more clout in their organizations, help them make these business cases that they would need to make, but get that information, get the C-suite to understand these things, so that they have this knowledge and recognize the role for what it is and situate it properly in a company. So a lot of work, I think, has to be done to build this role and create some more concrete resources and things that can be utilized to kind of drive the role forward and evolve it, so that it's not stuck in the spot that I see it stuck in now, which is that the responsibilities and the challenges keep growing, the laws keep growing, the complexity keeps growing, but the office is kind of still stuck where it has been stuck. The resources are kind of stagnant and not up there where they should be, and the power and abilities of the privacy officer aren't fully where they need to be, and so and the law is also, and enforcement isn't strong enough to create the kind of consistent pain points that and consistent concerns that really will kind of drive this. So driving it forward is I think the big challenge. How does this get driven forward in light of the fact that we can wait and hope for regulation to do it, and maybe that will be the case. I hope that laws will really turn up the heat a little bit. But in the absence of that, in our conversation, and what you've given a lot of insight to, is that there are internal things that could be done to try to drive things forward, even in the absence of the law. And those are things that will fall on the privacy officer to essentially, like, raise yourself up by your own bootstraps to some extent. And how do we help them? So this conversation, I think, is really helpful as a good step in that direction. We could certainly talk about this for hours on end, because I'd love to keep talking, because it's still a long way to solve it, but I hope that we've made a few steps. Thank you so much for your insights and for a really interesting conversation.
Okay, thanks for having me.